You're calling in the chat box. Today's learning circle will be exploring 23andMe brackets N with Elijah Buffalo. I'll ask the panelists to introduce themselves in just a few moments. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Seraine Squawkin. I'm the Learning Circle Manager. I'm Syilx Okanagan on my mother's side and Hickory, Apache, and Belgian on my father's side. I'll be your moderator for today's discussion, and joining us working behind the scenes is Cynthia, our production coordinator, our UBC Learning Circle assistants, Kira Lumley and Nicole North Pagan. They'll be in the background interacting with everyone in the chat. And finally, before we get into today's discussion, I'll just provide a gentle heads up that the topics covered may be sensitive or emotionally triggering. Please make sure that you are looking after yourself, and if at any point you feel that you need to talk to a friend, elder, counselor, or family member, don't hesitate to do so. We have some prompts in the chat for you if you need additional support. Now I'll turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves.
For starters, just thanks for inviting me. Thanks to UBC Learning Circle and to First Nations Health Authority for making this platform available for people to come and share. And I'll just introduce myself. Okamawa Pista Nitsigasan, Nehia Nipsigopak Musquechies Treaty 6, Otinia, Mwak Lakwungin, and Sanish Territory. Good morning, and thanks for everybody for coming today. My name is Elijah Buffalo. I'm from the Samson Cree Nation in Musquechies, Alberta, Treaty 6, and I live in Victoria. Something I thought about today that I've never done, but I've seen some people do like a physical description of themselves. And yeah, I don't normally do it, but I'm tired of people remarking how much taller I am in real life than they thought. So I'm about 6'2". I'm slim. I am wearing an orange shirt, and I have glasses, and I have short hair. And I wanted to say that as well, because in the photograph you see I have long hair, and I just wanted to share that I just cut my hair just last month because I'm in mourning from my mother passed away last month. So my mother is Dallas Dowson Buffalo, and my dad is Mel H. Buffalo. And on my maternal side, I have Norwegian and Welsh ancestors. And my grandparents are June Perry and Bill Dowson. And my great-grandparents are Agnes Olson and Edward Perry, Clifton Dowson, and Estella Parker. And there's always been some talk of some Indigenous blood on this side of the family, but in this day and age, I think that's a slippery slope to try and claim. But on my father's side, Bertha Sitting Weasel, Nokampan, Wilson Buffalo, Nemushampan, and my great-grandparents are Felix Buffalo, Ada Little Poplar, James Sitting Weasel, and Katie Dennehy. And my dad and my grandparents are survivors of Indian residential school. And so as I mentioned, I live in Lakwungin and Sanish Territory, and I attend the University of Victoria as an undergraduate student, where I have a research focus in Indigenous health, sports, and science. And I live here with my partner and stepchildren, one of whom is he's not here at the moment. He's recovering from a transtibial amputation in France. That was a result of a farming accident a couple months back. And so we're waiting for him to return. And of course, I live here as well with my trusty Daxon Winston, who's a huge part of my family. I'm also a student in the University of British Columbia's Indigenous Public Health Certificate Program, which is offered through the Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health. And so I was born in Edmonton, and I spent the first 8 years of my life in Treaty 6 territory. before moving to Nanaimo territory here on Vancouver Island. And I spent my summers and winter holidays usually in Muskogee, and then I'd return and go to school in Nanaimo, where I lived with my mom, my brother, and sisters. And eventually I attended VIU, where I obtained a BA in Indigenous Studies. And after university, I spent several years working for Indian Affairs as a human resources advisor in the Yukon region before coming back to Vancouver Island and transferring to the Department of National Defense, where I worked until going back to school full time. And going back to school full time for me wasn't an easy thing, and I'll get to that later. But it's where I am now. And it was through the Indigenous Public Health Institutes that I was invited to come and speak today, because through my participation in those programs, we call them institutes, and through my participation there, people learned that I have a podcast, and my podcast is called Metawewen, and it's a Cree word for sports, games, and I've described it as a podcast about sports and health. But on there, we talk about a lot more than just sports, such as arts, governance, and resurgence. And through this platform, I've had the opportunity to speak with some really amazing guests and personal heroes of mine, and it's been a really enriching experience so far. So a little more about my podcast. It was like, how did it come to be? Well, it was really a reaction, a personal response to the settler society's sudden move to address systemic racism a couple years back as a fallout of things like the George Floyd murder, where we started to see big organizations implementing more and meaningful diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies, and really making it more mainstream. And this is work that people in the government who are Indigenous or BIPOC, this is work that we've been doing really forever. And so to see the mainstream organizations sort of catching up and wanting to know more about it, it was kind of interesting. So at the time, there were a lot of webinars and meetings taking place, and sometimes people would be asked to share our experiences. And as I take time to reflect on issues, I started to think about the questions being asked and thinking about racism. And I thought back to really like the first time that I experienced overt racism, and that was through sport. And I thought about how much racism has been a part of any sport that I've played or competed in. And so I started to form this idea, or this I started to just think about, my experience as an Indigenous person, really being informed by my participation in sport. And I'll tell a little story about that experience with sport. It was when I first went to go play hockey, and I think I was 5 years old. And I'll back up and say that my first word was hockey. And growing up in Treaty 6 territory in the 80s, the Oilers were winning Stanley Cups. And really, it was just a magical time for sport. So I was in love with hockey, wanted to play. And finally, when I was at the age I could play, we went and got all the equipment, and they had these like equipment swaps. I think it was like down on just off White Ave. There's like a farmer's market area, And I remember going in there and just being amazed at the equipment. There was like surplus or old equipment from the Oilers, and I remember just being like in love with the equipment aspect of it. So anyway, I got all kitted up, and we went to the first tryout, and uh, my mom didn't know how to put the visor on my helmet, and so she just thought she could ask somebody at the tryout to help. And so we were in the dressing room, and there were a bunch of other men, the dads in there with their kids, and so she just asked if anyone could help, and they just ignored her. And so she asked again, and nobody would come forward, and so she was just like, well, I can't believe like none of you men are gonna help this single mother. And yeah, it was just like felt pretty strange. And I was like, okay, what's going on? Anyway, so she just sent me onto the ice with no visor on. And so I immediately I was like, oh, okay, well, there's something different between me and these white kids that are going out on the ice. And then the coaches were took me aside and were like, giving me a hard time, like why didn't I have the visor on? And so anyway, they ended up just letting me finish out the tryout. And on one hand, I felt cool because I didn't have a visor on, felt pro. But on the other hand, I was like, this is weird. And then after my mom explained to me like that it was probably racism, and to essentially get used to it because it's going to be a pervasive thing throughout life. And yeah, so uh, that was like really the beginning of racism in sport. And uh, as I started to think about this in terms of the podcast, I was like thinking about, maybe I could look at these barriers and systemic issues that are affecting Indigenous athletes, and really focusing on some of the other experience I had in life. And I was like, oh, well, um, yeah, I don't want to just like think about all the negative aspects of sports. And so when I began researching and reflecting on sports in Indigenous culture, I quickly moved away from that damage-based narrative um, of how Indigenous athletes are affected by racism. And then I started to think more about wanting to talk and speak with knowledge keepers on the importance of sport and games that in Indigenous culture, and that the importance that it has in our communities. And yeah, so that's when I really started to think about who I wanted to talk to. And since then, spoken to some really great people in the academy, some professional and elite athletes. And I also had a nice conversation with my dad in which he shared a lot about his story about residential school. And I've also used it as a platform to complete homework assignments. I did a research project where I completed the research apprenticeship through Lenonget at UVic, which is an incredible program. If anybody's thinking about going to UVic, I highly recommend taking part in that. It's a place where you can really learn about different research methodologies and really just be at the forefront of what's going on in these spaces. So back to the Indigenous Public Health training and the UBC Learning Circle. So when I was invited to come and speak, and I was asked, what did I want to talk about? I wasn't really sure because I definitely could drone on about sports and the role of sport and community and culture, and share my insights and knowledge of what I've seen, and also the knowledge and insights of the people that I've spoken to. But then through some of the work that I was doing with the IPH, the Indigenous Public Health Institute, it was suggested or asked of me about the role and presence of Indigenous men in these spaces of healthcare and healthcare education, and specifically about young men. And I've got limited experience when it comes to my own education into health. Uh, just want to preface that, like, I don't claim to be an expert on anything really, but I've been in what you'd call pre-med courses at UVic, and I've attended several of the IPH institutes now. And so far, I haven't encountered many other young Indigenous men. And so, in an effort to reduce the amount of alienating I'm going to do today, I'll start by saying that there have been men present, but they did not seem young. And that being said, I'm not that young either. And of course, I've been told that I look young, and perhaps, I haven't gone through all my rites of passage as a Nehiao person. So, in that sense, I am still somewhat young. And I also don't mean to perpetuate the colonial violence of heteropatriarchy and the Western gender binary system, as there have been trans people in these programs. And, I'm not aware of everybody's situation. And I also don't mean to be like, oh, where are the men? Like, we deserve to be here too. And I can appreciate that historically and culturally, professions like nursing they're a gender defined role, and many of the students in the IPH come from nursing. So it does make sense that this trend continues because, well, the system hasn't changed, and we're still affected by patriarchal systems of governance like the Indian Act. So when somebody asked me, why is there a paucity of young Indigenous men in these programs, I started to reflect on my own journey, and thus far, my own journey. It's been hard to get here to where I am, and I say that actually with a lot of privilege. But so that's where we got to where we are today, and I apologize if somebody thought maybe we were going to talk about genetic testing or something like that. But so I'll get to how the title came up in a bit. But going back to myself and to young men, young Indigenous men, when I think of the men from my age group, amongst my brothers and cousins and friends and neighbors, I'm limited in identifying many who also have the privilege to do what I've done. I went to university, I got a degree, but I barely graduated, and my GPA limited me from getting accepted to any post-bac or grad program out there. And I was rejected many times and eventually gave up. And thought, okay, I'm working for the federal government. It's a pretty good job, like, making pretty good money. And after essentially moving on from education, I just thought, okay, well, it's like the golden handcuffs. I can just do this until I retire, I suppose. But it wasn't what I wanted to be doing. And the more and more I thought about my treaty rights, my experience as an Indigenous person, I really felt the need to go back to school. And so I made a decision several years back now to go back to school, and maybe to be a little more humble about my approach, and not expect that some graduate programs just going to accept me. And so I started with taking one class at Camosun. I took a biology course there, and from there I did well in that, and then started to apply to programs again and was again rejected. So this damn GPA was just haunting me. But finally I applied to UVic again, was rejected. I submitted an appeal, and I was finally accepted to UVic in a week before classes started in 2020, September 2020. And I like to think that, well, I guess I've just deduced that I was probably accepted because the international students were unable to attend due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So finally, I was able to go back to school and start building up my GPA. And, you know, from performing well there, I was able to apply to programs like the Indigenous Public Health Training and doing well there as well. Then it seemed that opportunities began to come up for me. And through this, like I mentioned, I came at it with a bit of privilege. I was really only able to push on because I could afford to, and because I knew how to navigate these settler spaces, and because I had been in a position to do some self work, do some healing, and have confidence in my goals, and as well to have major support from my family. And yeah, so since then, I've been able to do some really amazing research opportunities. I attended the Sing Canada 2022 this year, and yeah, and I just have to say, like, I'm really happy with where I'm headed in life. So going back to this question of where are the men, and to address that, I think we have to consider the Indigenous prison population, and many of our men are in jail. And in my family, I have one brother who's in jail. I have one brother who just got out of jail, and I have another who's served an extended sentence as well. And when I was young and at extreme risk of falling into a life of gangs and crime, I was invited to take part in the tribes program at the University of New Mexico. And this was the Tribal Resource Institute of Business, Engineering, and Science. And this was put on through the Department of Native American Studies. And this is really what set me on my path to education. It was a mix of land-based and classroom education. And yeah, it was just a really great way to get into post-secondary education, because up until that point, I was not really sure that I wanted to go to school. And I went there with another person from my First Nation, and we were the only two from Canada. And this young man had a similar upbringing that I did. He was similarly at risk for the things in his life, and he didn't continue into education, and he got caught up in crime and drugs. And he was actually even shot a couple years back, and he continues to deal with violent drug charges and things like that. So I think we can just see that that there are just inherent risks associated with colonialism that that are affecting us. And I guess, you know, I should say that this is not limited to just Indigenous men. I know that, of course, but yeah, we've got so many people also just entangled in the court system. And my sister, Jessica Buffalo, she's a lawyer in Alberta. She shared with me things about the seemingly perpetual cycle of Indigenous people dealing with unnecessary charges or malicious prosecution, and getting embroiled in these matters often take years to resolve. And this in itself can be traumatizing, especially for young people. And this normalization of what it means to interact with the settler system often sets them on a path that's difficult to get off of. And once you have a criminal record, is there any chance of being accepted to a professional program like medicine? I don't think so. And so we can see that the labor market availability of Indigenous people who can even apply to medical school is cut from the 5% of the population that we make up I'm not really sure. I don't have the numbers of Indigenous people who have a criminal record, but taking a look at my 10 brothers and sisters, we can see that this number would be halved. So the title of my talk today, 23 and Me, 23 and Men, is looking at the calls to action. And none of the issues that the calls to action are specific to exist in isolation. They overlap, and of course, they can all be traced back to colonialism and things like residential school. And in looking at the prison population, we have to acknowledge that many of our people experience the trauma of the child welfare system. And of course, this speaks to call to action number one. And everybody should be aware by now that we have more Indigenous children in care now than at the height of residential schools. And as long as we see that the chances of going to jail increase because of your experience of living in care as a child, we'll continue to see lower representation in places like the healthcare field. So, yeah, like how did we get here? In wanting to talk about call to action 23, and then specifically the subsection 1, increase the number of Aboriginal professionals working in the healthcare field. So taking like a holistic or just like a full look at the calls to action, I think it was sometimes about call to action 88. And this is one of the sports ones. And so call to action 88 determines and defines what is appropriate participation in sports for Indigenous people. And this is limited by its investment in the North American Indigenous Games, which ages athletes out at 19. And so this is some wording that I've learned from Dr. Janice Forsyth regarding how colonialism sought to impose a proper way to participate in sports for Indigenous people and what was appropriate for boys and girls. So this colonial, really like hegemonic way of defining and determining how we're participating in these colonial systems is a consistent trend throughout the reconciliation conversation. And talking about the conversation of sports and participation in games, this is always, and I got this again from Dr. Janice Forsyth, this has always been viewed as a means to enhance an assimilated national identity. And this is like a move towards social inclusion for Indigenous peoples by participating in mainstream sports, and going back to residential schools and why sports was such an important part of the assimilative process was to break down the cultural identity of what it meant to be an Indigenous person, whether that was a man or a woman, and really focusing on the heteropatriarchy that the Indian Act and other colonial policies and programs sought to impose upon us. So we need to ask, what are Indigenous peoples wanting to do with sport? So I'm just going back to this example of sport. And are we as athletes just trying to become professionals or to be successful on a national or international stage? Or are we trying to improve and build our health, culture, and community through this active form of decolonization? And the same thinking needs to be applied to call to action 23. Indigenous people, I can't really say all, and I guess, yeah, this is my opinion. So maybe I should just say that, like, my participation in this isn't to get into a professional program like medicine to climb the social ladder. Um, it's really to take part in something that will allow me to serve my community, uh, to decolonize these systems, and really to just improve the situation that we're in because of colonization. And so, yeah, like that's one thing that I don't think is fully considered in reconciliation is why are Indigenous peoples wanting to take part in these systems. And yeah, like there's been a lot of good work done in institutions, in through government, and a lot of people have been working on increasing the numbers of Indigenous people in these systems since before the TRC. And a lot of organizations have some really great initiatives in place, but it's clearly not meeting the needs of Indigenous communities. And thinking about the response here, it's somewhat measured and considerate to the settler population, and it doesn't really represent, well, it doesn't represent a nation to nation relationship to achieve reconciliation. And to Indigenous people, to me, healthcare is a serious issue. And every day in our communities and our families, these are matters of life and death, and matters of our nationhood and self-determination, and our relationships to our land and waters. These are all dependent upon our healthcare and our health. So we should expect a serious response. And perhaps we should be expecting like a more serious mobilization. And yeah, like I don't use that word or imagery loosely, as the call to serve in this manner should be treated with a response that respects the nationhood of the people. And thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, when I worked as a staffing advisor, we'd be working with managers and hiring managers to try to solve the issue of underrepresentation of Indigenous people in positions. And I often suggested that we use the legislative tools of the Public Service Employment Act to limit the area of selection, where we could target a vacancy to just hire an Indigenous person. And yeah, like I kind of always just said, if we have vacancies, why don't we just hire Indigenous people? But this concept just could not catch on. And some of the arguments against it would be like, well, the labor market availability dictates that there aren't enough Indigenous applicants to do this anyway, or that they wouldn't be getting the best applicants. And so we'd have to settle for the odd token Indigenous hire here and there. But if we're talking about what the Prime Minister calls nation to nation relationships, then I think we need to expand the response to implement calls to action like 23. And I guess, yeah, like I don't know everything that's going on, and perhaps this is already happening. So if it is, that's great. But Indigenous nations should be a part of determining the implementation of this in these systems. So they should be a part of determining who is selected to take part in this healthcare education. And in some cases, such as in Treaty 6 territory, we have this capability built into our Treaty 6 principle of healthcare. And as well, this is built into Article 23 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And yeah, so in that, it says that Indigenous people have the right to determine and develop priorities and strategies for exercising their right to development. In particular, Indigenous people have the right to be actively involved in developing and determining health, and then there's a number of other ones, but essentially that's what I wanted to make the point of. So it's great that we do see institutions and organizations addressing 23 and 24. And some of it is just implementing mandatory training and courses on cultural competency and safety, but it's not really what Indigenous communities need. And communities require their own healthcare professionals who understand their needs and their experience and are in relationship to them through shared culture and shared identity, rather than a non-Indigenous doctor or nurse who's taken a course where, once again, our bodies, our trauma, and our colonial conditions are objectified through Western instruction in a course in a school. And that's not to say that the instruction is not valid and it's not good and that it's not having good outcomes. But at the end of the day, it's not what a lot of people have in mind for reconciliation. So that's where I think we need to look at this more from the nation to nation standpoint. And I think everybody is aware of most of the statistics around Indigenous peoples. It's if something's bad, we're high. If it's good, we're underrepresented. And also, Indigenous people's population is growing, I believe, at twice the rate of the non-Indigenous population. So we can expect more and more Indigenous peoples to go to university and become healthcare professionals. But we still know that we have way too many children in care. And from that, many of these will end up in prison, and many won't even make it at all. And yeah, like I've said, I don't have all the answers. And there are a lot more qualified people than me, actually doing work, not just thinking about it. But yeah, so I don't know if I have the right to be making suggestions on this stuff, but just from my experience, I do know that in order to meet a call to action like 23, we also have to meet call to action 30. And to meet call to action 30, we have to meet call to action 1. And so none of these can be done alone or in isolation. And any settler system that attempts to do so will not be successful in achieving reconciliation. So that was kind of all I wanted to talk about with my notes here. So yeah, so I think we can move on. I saw lots of questions or comments coming up here. I didn't have a look at any of them yet, but where the UBC Learning Circle has built in some time where we can have questions and a broader discussion. So I think that we can move towards that at this time.
My personal question is, what are your goals for your education now that you're studying at UVic? Like, are you hoping to stay in healthcare, or are you hoping to enter a new industry, or like what does your path look like?
Yeah, I'd like to become a medical doctor, and it's a tough road, and we'll see how that goes. But that's what I find my calling to be, to work in medicine. And I've mentioned to people before that in my family we were leaders and healers and speakers, and this knowledge was taught to everybody up until my dad. And so I refuse to be the first generation to not work in for the health of my community and for my people. So that's what I'd like to do. I've been studying metabolism through my interest in sport. So that started with really kind of trying to avoid type 2 diabetes. I'm trying to learn about how that all worked, and then learning about sports performance. And in learning that if you want to learn about diabetes, then you're going to also learn about optimal sports performance, because the continuum of health and performance is in thinking of metabolism, it's all the same. And so so I did a bit of research on that, and with the focus that some of the major health issues that we have are related to type 2 diabetes, and from there doing additional research and eventually uh, shifting towards cancer research. And so probably that's my main focus these days, is learning about cancer. And so the uh, the opportunity to do cancer research in Indigenous communities and with people is something that I'm interested in as well.
That'd be awesome to see you as a doctor. I mean, like even just the work you're doing right now is like incredible, and um, we're so like fortunate to have you on as our guest. And I'm just wondering, my next question is, do you have any words of encouragement for any of the other Indigenous men out there that are hoping to pursue a career in medicine or not education, healthcare?
Yeah, I think just focus on your healing and self-work and find what works for you. I mean, it's tough to give advice, I find, but I just think to you know, our elder Jerry Oldman through the IPH, he often shares that if somebody finds something that works for them and it's working, then just focus on that and do what you can. Um, I don't know exactly what I could say, because I wouldn't want to force my ideals onto people. In terms of sport as well, I struggled with that, with trying to encourage people to get fit or to improve their performance. Something that works for me is not going to work for many other people. And yeah, and I mean, if I was to think about that, actually, to think about what worked for me was, maybe it didn't even really work that well because it took so long. But with my sport, I did things alone for much of my experience in my sport of road cycling, which is an individual sport. There's only one winner, and even though you can be part of a team, except in some sports like my good friend Amiel Flett Brown, who's a member of the national team for Canada. He's on the team pursuit squad, and that's a track cycling discipline. And so that's a team sport. But for what I do in road cycling, there's only one winner, and I really focused on solitude for probably too long. So yeah, I don't know. I think just focus on what you can do, and to reach out to other people. Yeah, I think that's something I wish I would have done earlier. is to be more to be more inclusive in finding help.
That's so true. Like our community helps us grow and like helps us reach our goals, and especially putting the manifesting those goals by explaining them out loud, like to other people, is like a great way to manifest them and to be a part of and it allows them to be a part of your journey too, to help support you in other ways, which is really cool. Like I like how you're explaining how it's good to focus on yourself and to work on yourself, but it's also like good to invest in your community. And I think that's very true. Like I know a lot of people who have a mixture of both go really far in life, and it's really awesome. Our next question is, how have you managed to maintain the clarity amongst the din and noise of reconciliation without total withdrawing, which myself, uh, I wrestle with a 52-year-old Nuchanalth woman in relation to the ways my own nations have engaged with resource extraction. Oh, I think you're, oh, no, I thought
Yeah, I think just going back to focusing on what you can do. Um, yeah, like that's a good question, because it really ties in the fact that we're individuals in these spaces, but we're representing our nations and the relationships that we have with the land. And I've sometimes joked about the calls to action, the sports one, that I didn't see much value in it, uh, except if it could find me a team, a spot on like the Olympic team or something like that. Um, so yeah, I think that really understanding that the outcome and success of our nations isn't reliant on what the government, what the settler governments are going to do in regard to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action. And if we look at it from that nation to nation standpoint, if the work is being done in that context, then we can give more value to it. And so I think like understanding that is how I make sense of the of what's going on in the space of reconciliation.
Definitely. Our next question is, they appreciated your words on and thoughts on hiring, and they wanted to know, do you have any thoughts about how they might change or influence organizational criteria to see that First Nation hires might not meet the criteria, but bring important information to the support increasing the system?
Yeah, I think like I've often thought of this as building capacity for, it's like hiring someone that doesn't meet the organizational criteria, the essential qualifications. um, I think you have to think about the concept of why do these people want to work there, and why do Indigenous peoples want to take part in working for the government. And for a lot of people, it's not to, um, you know, to have this assimilative outcome. It's there so that they can build capacity, support their family, and oftentimes give back to their community. And that doesn't always happen, but um, that's where I think like I tried to start to tell people about in hiring. It's like these people don't want to be here to be Canadians. They want to be here to be Indigenous peoples of their nation. And this one argument where people say, "Oh, we're not going to get the best people. We're not going to get the best applicants." Well, you're not going to get the best applicants anyway. It's like, you think the best people want to come and work for the government? And there's amazing people that work for the government, but to buy into this meritocracy that that your position, that your advertising is going to get the best person to come, it's not feasible. It's not unrealistic. And if we extrapolate that to the healthcare field, it's like, oh, if we do the same thing there, we lower the standards, we're not going to get the best people. Well, if you talk to a lot of people in medicine and in healthcare and stuff, well, you'll see that the so-called high performers that perhaps would have gone to medical school 20 years ago, well, they're no longer going to med school because, well, you don't get paid that much to begin with, and it's becoming less and less glamorous. So there's studies out there, you can check them out, where now they find that these people are going into finance. So are those the best people? Or like, who's the best people to be doing it? I think it's the people that want to serve. So yeah, so I'll just leave it at that.
That's so true. Like, I feel like we have to change the way we're actually evaluating the criteria for hiring on people, because even just what you're saying about saying the best person to hire, like that sounds like a characteristic of white supremacy, of perfectionism, and perfectionism is not going to bring us anywhere. It's just going to put anyone like make them feel burnout, or make them feel like they're not enough, which is not uplifting and hiring the greatest person, right? Like, because like you said, it's the greatest person is probably not going to be working for these organizations. They could be working for something else. And when are you actually going to achieve that person either? Like, because you can have the best person but then not invest in them in other ways, and that can really take a burden on some people. Our next question is, what do you talk about in your podcasts, and what is the schedule like, and how do I tune in?
Yeah, so I saw up in the chat there, some people, Learning Circle people shared the links to the podcast. So yeah, it's like on Apple or Spotify. And so that's where you can find it. Scheduling wise, I wasn't really sure like how it was all going to work at first. And so in the beginning, I was trying to do like one per month or so. And then my schedule sort of limited what I could do. And once I started to do a few other things, I didn't have the time to work on it. So I guess people in the podcast world call them seasons. And I had like, I guess, one season. And yeah, so now I'm just thinking and planning my next conversations that I'm going to have with people. And so we'll see where it goes from there. So was there a question about, can you read the question again?
Yeah. So it's just, what do you talk about in your podcasts? What does your schedule look like, and how do I tune in?
Yeah. So what do I talk about? It probably will remain health and wellness and sort of sports driven conversations. But yeah, like I talk about art as well. And I think the next set of guests that I have on, I want to talk about people who are making things, and um, in relation to sport or art or culture. So that's where I think that's where we're going to go next.
And what's the best way to keep in touch and get notified for when you have a new podcast? Do you have like a newsletter or something?
No, probably, I don't know. There's the best way. I probably could think about some better ways to do it. But yeah, Twitter. Probably start sharing more on Twitter. And yeah, so I have a Twitter. It is. I saw somebody put up my website, Experimony, and that's the Twitter handle as well. And that's probably where I'll share the podcast going forward.
Cool. And you were talking about Experimony. What does your art like talk about? Like, is there any like theme or anything that you really speak to that resonates with you when you're doing the art, or is it more like freestyle and like flow art?
I think it's really depends on, I draw a lot of uh, images that are personal to my understanding of the universe, and I've incorporated or borrowed or stolen, uh I shouldn't say that like that, but in my travels, I've seen some art that just really speaks to me, and so I incorporate that, such as uh I think it's called like the Shawana, like the clouds that I saw in New Mexico. And um those that way of depicting clouds just always spoke to me, and so sometimes I include that. But I do a lot of thinking and research into the stars and the star blanket designs, and really thinking about that sort of multi-dimensionally, and looking at the geometry of it all, and trying to understand what our ancestors understood and saw about these images and these constellations. And then yeah, sometimes I just draw stuff that feels good, and sometimes making a statement. Like this, I did this shirt here, and this is like the Jordan Jumpman design. And of course, it's the guy with the eagle staff or a coup stick, and he's leaping, and he's going to be counting coup on somebody. And I think that the messaging behind that is there's a lot of symbols and imagery built into that. It's like, on one hand, it's appropriating or making light of capitalism and this symbol that is representative of sport. And a lot of people in our communities love basketball, so you see this image. You often see it tattooed on people, the Jordan symbol. And what does it represent? I guess it's for them, their personal gives them strength, their sport, taking part in that. But also I think about the company of Nike. And we have Nike N7, which is a marketing campaign geared towards Indigenous people. And we have influencers on social media who are N7 representatives, and they promote this gear. It's got some Indigenous imagery on it, but at the same time, we ignore the fact that Nike supports and forces the Uyghurs into slave labor and human rights atrocities and genocide. So to me, that's really what that experience was about in producing this image.
Someone was said it was awesome, and they were wondering what if they can order them for you, or do you sell them?
Yeah, I'm going to be uh, engaging in a lawsuit with Nike. No, I'm just kidding. No, I'm going to be maybe seeing if I can sell these at some point. I was pretty busy all summer, but yeah, art to me is one of the biggest things that I need to do in life, and so I have been threatening to sell some art for some time now. And yeah, I've got a couple designs that I'll put on some shirts uh, and and put up for sale as well. Just trying to carve out some time to do that.
That's awesome. And what does experimony mean? Like, is it a mix of two words, or is it just like, what does it mean?
Yeah, I think in terms of thinking about research methodology, um, I think that's how I came up with that. You know, it's like doing science, we're doing experiments, and we're also doing ceremony. So I guess it's a combination of those two words, experiment and ceremony, because they can't really be separated, and they shouldn't.
Mhm. Someone popped on late. They were just wondering how um, connecting to the land is beneficial to health, like focusing on environmental practices, conservation, sustainability, etc. They're linked to cultural practices and traditions such as medicinal plant use and food. Like, and the next part is part of what I want to do is present an argument explaining how these practices and their links to culture and land are beneficial to the healthcare system. Do you have any thoughts or comments about this?
Well, I think that's the heart of what health really means to us is the fact that all of that other stuff is can't be separated from it. So yeah, I'm not sure how to properly answer that, but I just have to say that you know, Western systems tend to create these boxes where we put things into, and oftentimes we call this siloing. And yeah, we just have to know that everything is in relation to everything else, and that's not like a wishy-washy way of just saying that everything's connected and promoting this pan-indigenous understanding of things. But uh, it sounds like I don't know. I'd have to read the question. I didn't see it, but um, yeah, it sounds like they already know that the importance of health to all the other stuff is. Yeah, sorry. I hope
No,
that helped.
I feel like what I'm trying to gather from what you were talking about earlier, and also like right now, is that health can be kind of seen in a holistic approach in indigenous like cultures and whatnot, and it can be impacted by the community. It can be impacted by the land because we um, are stewards to the land. So like when the land is impacted, it impacts the indigenous people to that nation, and we also nourish ourselves from the land. So when it's not being treated properly, that can also affect our own nutrition for ourselves. And
Hmm.
we're saying earlier, community is a really big thing. And a lot of the times when we're gathering, hunting, or fishing, we are in a community setting doing that as a community as a whole. So when it's the environment is being impacted, it can impact the community, the nutrition of the community, and our future generations.
Yeah. And I think too, the separation from ourselves and the land and our more than human relatives is something that we need to bridge to bring back that understanding of relationship, that you can't have one without the other. And that's something that I really learned at the University of Alberta this summer when I went to the Sing Canada program. And we had the opportunity to do an experiment in Treaty 6 territory where we respectfully sampled some soil to learn more about the microbiome within the soil and what that meant to the health of the land and what that meant to the health of the people and the animals. And, you know, comparing it to the soil gathered from an industrial or just like a regular farm in the prairie, you can see that the health was not good in the industrial farm. And so that can be related back to, you know, like if we live in these areas that we're not taking part in relation to the land in a way that you know, that considers all of the other beings and our relatives, then it's going to be unhealthy. And yeah, so yeah, I think we just have to really understand that, you know, we're not separate from our more than human relatives. And if you even think about yourself, there's more bacterial cells than in you than there are human cells. So who are you? Yeah. Or what are you? I don't know.
That was our last question. So we will bring this webinar to a close. Thank you to all our panelists and everyone for joining us today. And thank you so much, Elijah, for your amazing discussion. It was great to hear you talk about health and how Indigenous men can take part in health, and also explaining your story about your journey to pursue medicine and some of the hardships that you went through to get to that point, and where you're to share your journey along that. And just before we end the webinar, we'd love to bring your attention to our upcoming UBC Learning Circle webinars. Our next one is building the Yenesitin Quen Fire Stewardship Program, Insights from the Field. This is a fire prevention program that is presented by William and Russell. That'll be next October 12th at 10 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. And then we'll also have Keepers of the Water, Protecting Water in the Arctic Basin and the Current Threats to Water, with Jesse Cardinal and Daniel Tisell. That one is on October 18th at 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. And sign up for our webinars and by signing up for our newsletter. The link will be in the chat. All of the webinars are free to sign up for on our website at www.learningscircle.ubc.ca. And thank you for everyone for joining us today. We look forward to seeing everyone at our next Learning Circle. Lim Limt, thank you.
Thank you. Hi. Thanks for coming, everybody.